The morning sun streamed through the tall glass windows of Atlanta International Airport as Thomas Johnson made his way through the bustling main terminal. At 38 years old, Thomas carried himself with the quiet discipline of someone who had seen things most people couldn't imagine. The retired Marine Corps sergeant had served 3 tough tours in Afghanistan, and though he'd been home for 5 years now, parts of him never really left the battlefield. Walking steadily beside Thomas was Rex, his certified service dog. The German Shepherd moved with purpose, his alert eyes constantly checking on his owner, while his paws patted softly across the polished airport floor. Rex wore a bright blue service vest with official patches that clearly identified him as a working animal, not a pet. "Today's gonna be a good day, boy," Thomas whispered, reaching down to briefly touch Rex's head. The dog responded with a gentle nudge against his leg. These small interactions helped keep Thomas grounded whenever he entered crowded, noisy places like airports, spaces that could sometimes trigger his PTSD. Thomas had planned everything carefully. They'd arrived 2 hours before the flight to San Diego, where his sister was expecting them for her son's high school graduation. He packed light, just 1 duffel bag and a small backpack. He wore comfortable jeans, a plain navy button-up shirt, and a veteran's cap that his old unit had given him. In his pocket was a folder containing all of Rex's paperwork, including his service animal certification, vaccination records, and training documentation. "We've done this a dozen times," Thomas reminded himself as they approached the airline's check-in counter. He'd flown with Rex on 6 different airlines over the past 3 years without any major issues. Occasionally there'd be questions, but a quick look at Rex's papers always resolved things quickly. The line moved steadily forward. Thomas observed the other travelers, families heading on vacation, business people typing hurriedly on phones, college students with oversized backpacks. An elderly couple in front of him smiled and asked if they could admire Rex without petting him. Thomas appreciated their understanding that service dogs shouldn't be distracted. "He's beautiful," the woman said. "Our grandson has a service dog too. Helps with his seizures." Thomas nodded with a smile. "They're amazing animals. Rex here has changed my life completely." When the couple moved on to their gate, Thomas stepped up to the counter. A woman with thin-framed glasses and perfectly styled hair glanced up, her name tag reading Pamela. Her eyes immediately dropped to Rex, and Thomas noticed her expression shift from professional courtesy to something harder. "Next passenger," she called, seemingly looking past Thomas even though he was directly in front of her. "Good morning," Thomas said, sliding his ID and flight information across the counter. "I'm checking in for the 11:30 to San Diego." Pamela barely glanced at his documents. "Is that your pet?" she asked, pointing at Rex. "This is Rex, my service animal," Thomas explained calmly. "I have all his documentation right here." He pulled out the folder and placed it on the counter. Pamela didn't reach for it. "We don't allow animals that size in the cabin. He'll need to go in cargo." Thomas felt a familiar tightness begin to spread across his chest. Rex, sensing the change in his body chemistry, pressed against his leg. A trained response to help interrupt the anxiety before it could escalate. "Ma'am, under the Air Carrier Access Act, service animals are permitted tow." "I know the rules," Pamela cut him off. "But that looks like a pet to me. I don't see any disability." Her voice carried to nearby passengers who began to glance over. Thomas took a deep breath. He'd faced Taliban fighters and IEDs. He could handle this situation with dignity. But as more eyes turned toward them, and Pamela continued to speak loudly about people trying to bring pets everywhere these days, Thomas realized this was going to be different from his previous flying experiences. Something in Pamela's tone told him this was just the beginning of what was about to become a very public confrontation. Pamela's fingers tapped impatiently on her keyboard. "I need to see some kind of proof that this is actually a service animal," she said, her voice carrying across the check-in area. The line behind Thomas grew longer, and he could feel curious eyes on his back. "I understand," Thomas replied, keeping his voice steady despite the rising tension. He slid the folder closer to her. "Everything's right here, his certification, training documentation, and my doctor's letter." Pamela picked up the folder with 2 fingers like it might be contaminated. She flipped through the papers quickly, barely looking at them. Other airline staff glanced over, but no one stepped in to help. "These papers don't mean anything to me," she said, pushing the folder back across the counter. "Anyone can print these off the internet these days." Thomas felt his heart rate increasing. Rex sensed it immediately and pressed more firmly against his leg, performing his trained task to help Thomas stay centered. A few people in line shifted uncomfortably, sensing the growing tension. "Ma'am, Rex is a certified service animal who helps me manage my PTSD from military service," Thomas explained, his voice lower now, trying to maintain some privacy. He tapped his veteran's cap. "I've flown with him many times, including on your airline." Pamela's expression hardened. "Well, policies change. And frankly, sir, you don't look disabled to me." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He'd heard similar comments before. The invisible nature of PTSD meant he often had to justify his need for Rex, but never so publicly and never so dismissively from someone in an official position. An older man in line behind Thomas cleared his throat. "Excuse me, miss, but that's not an appropriate thing to say." Pamela's eyes flashed with annoyance. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. Please wait your turn." Thomas took a deep breath and tried again. "I'd like to speak with a supervisor, please." He kept his voice level, drawing on years of military discipline. "Fine," Pamela said sharply. She picked up a phone and spoke briefly, then turned to Thomas. "You can step aside and wait over there. A supervisor will be with you when they're available." She immediately called "Next Customer" and waved forward the person standing behind Thomas. Feeling dismissed but determined not to escalate the situation, Thomas and Rex moved to the side of the counter. Minutes ticked by as Pamela continued processing other passengers, occasionally shooting glances their way. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Rex remained steady beside him, but Thomas could feel sweat beginning to form on his brow. A young couple with a baby stroller gave Thomas sympathetic looks as they passed. "That's not right," the man said quietly. "My cousin's a vet too." Thomas nodded in thanks but stayed focused on his breathing. In, out, techniques his therapist had taught him. Rex remained a solid, comforting presence. After 30 minutes of standing aside, being stared at by passing travelers, Thomas approached the counter again. "Excuse me, I've been waiting for quite some time now. Is a supervisor coming?" Pamela looked up with obvious irritation. "They're very busy. You'll just have to wait." "My flight board's in less than an hour," Thomas explained. "That's not my problem," she replied loudly. "Maybe next time you'll think about leaving your pet at home. Some people have actual allergies to deal with." The comment was loud enough that several nearby passengers turned to look. An elderly woman sitting nearby frowned. A businessman in line raised his eyebrows. Thomas felt his face grow warm, a mixture of embarrassment and frustration washing over him. Rex, sensing his increasing distress, began to perform more of his trained responses, including applying gentle pressure against Thomas's leg and looking up at him with steady eyes. "He's not a pet," Thomas said firmly. "He's a service animal, and I have the right to fly with him." Something in his tone must have caught the attention of other travelers, because now more people were watching the exchange. The atmosphere in the check-in area began to shift as the confrontation became impossible to ignore. The tension in the air was impossible to ignore now. Thomas stood tall, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes, but inside he felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The airport's bright fluorescent lights, the constant announcements over the speakers, and the growing crowd of onlookers were exactly the kind of sensory overload that Rex was trained to help him manage. "Is there a problem here?" A deep voice broke through the murmuring of the crowd. Thomas turned to see a middle-aged man in an airline uniform with a supervisor badge. His nameplate read Bill. Finally, Thomas said, relief evident in his voice, "I've been waiting for over half an hour." Bill glanced between Thomas and Pamela, then at Rex. "What seems to be the issue?" Before Thomas could answer, Pamela jumped in. "This passenger is insisting on bringing his pet dog into the cabin. I've explained our policy, but he's being difficult and making a scene." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. "That's not accurate," he said evenly. "Rex is my service animal, not a pet. I have all the proper documentation, which your quality has refused to properly review. And I wasn't making any scene until I was left standing here for 30 minutes. Bill looked uncomfortable, caught between his employee and a clearly upset customer. "Let me see the paperwork," he said, extending his hand. Thomas handed over the folder again, watching as Bill actually took the time to look through the documents. As he waited, he noticed more people gathering around. The check-in line had grown longer, with frustrated passengers watching the drama unfold instead of being helped. "Your documentation seems to be in order," Bill finally admitted, handing the folder back. "But we do have concerns about larger animals in the cabin. Rex is a service animal covered under the Air Carrier Access Act," Thomas explained, trying to keep his voice steady despite his growing frustration. "He's trained to perform specific tasks related to my disability." "What exactly is your disability?" Pamela interjected sharply. "You look perfectly fine to me." A collective gasp rose from several onlookers. Even Bill looked startled by her directness. Thomas felt his face flush with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Rex, sensing Thomas's stress levels rising, pressed firmly against his leg and looked up, performing his trained task to interrupt the anxiety cycle. "I don't have to disclose the specifics of my medical condition to you," Thomas said, his voice quieter but firm. "The law is clear on that. But since you've decided to make this public, I'm a combat veteran with PTSD, and Rex helps me manage my symptoms in public spaces like this." A woman stepped forward from the growing crowd of onlookers. She wore a business suit and had a professional air about her. "Excuse me," she said firmly. "I couldn't help overhearing this conversation. I'm Dr. Linda Wilson, and I specialize in neurological disorders at Memorial Hospital. What's happening here is completely inappropriate." Thomas hadn't asked for help, but he felt grateful for the intervention. Rex remained steady beside him, doing exactly what he was trained to do, providing stability in a chaotic situation. Dr. Wilson pulled out her phone. "I'm recording this interaction now, with your permission," she said to Thomas, who nodded. "The airline staff is violating federal regulations regarding service animals. The Air Carrier Access Act is very clear about this." Bill's expression changed from uncomfortable to worried. "Ma'am, there's no need to record." "I think there is," came another voice. An elderly man using a cane stepped forward. "My brother was a Vietnam vet. Had a service dog for years. This young man deserves respect, not harassment." More voices joined in from the crowd. "I've been standing in line for 20 minutes while you made this man wait. That's discrimination. Let him and his dog on the plane." Thomas hadn't expected this. He'd faced discrimination before, sideways glances, uncomfortable questions, the occasional confrontation, but he'd never experienced strangers coming to his defense like this. Rex sensed the shift in Thomas's emotions and remained vigilant but calm. A family with 2 young children approached Thomas. The father, a tall man in a business suit, reached out his hand. "My kids wanted to know if they could say hello to you and thank you for your service," he said quietly. "My father was military too, 20 years in the army." Thomas shook the man's hand, momentarily speechless at how quickly the situation had transformed from isolating discrimination to an unexpected show of support. Dr. Linda Wilson kept her phone camera steady as she moved closer to the check-in counter. She was supposed to be on her way to a medical conference in Los Angeles, but something about this situation struck a personal chord. Her brother had returned from Iraq with similar invisible wounds. "For the record," she said clearly, "this gentleman has presented proper documentation for his service animal, which you have rejected without valid reason. This is a direct violation of the Air Carrier Access Act." Bill shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the growing crowd of onlookers. Some people had their phones out now too. This was quickly becoming the kind of incident that ended up on the evening news or, worse, going viral online. "Ma'am, please stop recording," Bill said. "This is a private matter between the airline and our passenger." "It stopped being private when your staff publicly questioned his disability and made him wait for 30 minutes, Dr. Wilson replied calmly. She turned to Thomas. "I've seen this happen too many times. My brother is a veteran with PTSD, and he faces this kind of discrimination regularly." Thomas nodded gratefully. Rex remained perfectly behaved at his side, exactly as he'd been trained. The German Shepherd's calm demeanor was itself a powerful statement. This was clearly no ordinary pet. A young woman in another airline's uniform approached. She was wearing a passenger badge, apparently traveling on her day off. "Excuse me," she said, addressing Bill directly. "I'm a flight attendant with Coastal Airlines. We receive extensive training on the Air Carrier Access Act. Service animals like this one are explicitly protected by federal law. The documentation he's provided is more than sufficient." The crowd had grown to at least 20 people now. Normal check-in operations had essentially ground to a halt. Passengers waiting in line were either watching the confrontation unfold or checking their watches with increasing frustration. Bill seemed to realize the situation was spiraling beyond his control. "Let me call my manager," he said, reaching for a phone behind the counter. "That's what you said 30 minutes ago," Thomas pointed out. "Meanwhile, my flight board's soon. All I want is to check in and go to my gate like everyone else." A middle-aged couple pushed through the crowd. The woman approached Thomas with a sympathetic smile. "Our son served in the Marines," she said. "He has his own service dog at home. What you're going through right now is exactly what we feared when he got Carter." Her husband nodded. "This is unacceptable. We'd like to stand with you, if that's okay." Thomas felt a lump in his throat. He'd gone from feeling isolated and embarrassed to surrounded by unexpected allies. Rex sensed the change in his emotional state and relaxed slightly, though he remained attentive. The elderly man with the cane who had spoken up earlier raised his voice. "In my day, we respected our veterans. This young man served our country, and this is how you treat him." Several people nodded in agreement. The atmosphere in the terminal had shifted dramatically. What began as an uncomfortable confrontation between one passenger and airline staff had transformed into something much larger, a spontaneous community standing up against what they perceived as injustice. Pamela, who had been relatively quiet since Bill arrived, suddenly spoke up. "We can't have large animals loose in the cabin. It's a safety issue. What if he attacks someone?" The off-duty flight attendant shook her head. "Service animals undergo rigorous training. They're specifically selected for their temperament and ability to remain calm in stressful situations. Looking at this dog right now, completely calm in this chaotic environment, should tell you everything you need to know." Dr. Wilson continued recording. "I'd like to point out that questioning whether a service animal is dangerous without any evidence is another form of discrimination." Bill returned to the counter, his expression grave. "I've spoken with my superior. She's on her way down here now." Finally, Thomas said. He checked his watch. "My flight board's in 30 minutes. The crowd had grown even larger. Airport security officers hovered at the edges, monitoring the situation but not intervening. Several children pointed at Rex with interest, while their parents used the moment to quietly explain what service dogs do. Thomas hadn't intended to become the center of attention. He just wanted to catch his flight to see his sister. But as he looked around at the faces of strangers standing up for him, he realized that something remarkable was happening, something that went beyond his own journey that day. The buzz of conversation grew louder as word spread through the terminal. People who had nothing to do with Thomas's flight paused to see what was happening. Some joined the growing circle around the check-in counter, while others watched from nearby seating areas or restaurant tables. An elderly woman with silver hair and a floral print dress pushed her way through to the front. She walked with a slight limp but carried herself with dignity. "Young man," she called out to Thomas, her voice surprisingly strong. "My husband was a Vietnam veteran. He had nightmares until the day he died." Her eyes were kind but fierce. He never got the help he needed or the respect he deserved. Things are supposed to be different now. Thomas nodded respectfully. "Thank you, ma'am." "I'm not finished," she said, turning to face Bill and Pamela. "Shame on you both. That dog is better behaved than half the people on any flight I've ever taken." A ripple of approving laughter moved through the crowd. Rex remained perfectly still beside Thomas, his training evident in how he handled the commotion. A family with 2 young boys approached. The mother smiled at Thomas. "Would you mind if my sons asked you a few questions? They've never met a real hero before." Before Thomas could answer, the younger boy blurted out, "Is that a police dog?" Thomas smiled, crouching down to the boy's level. "No, Rex is a service dog. He helps me when things get tough." "Like a superhero sidekick?" the older boy asked. "Something like that. Thomas replied, feeling some of his tension ease. It was hard to stay anxious with the genuine curiosity of children. The boy's father stepped forward. "We're on your flight to San Diego. My sons would be honored to sit near a veteran and his service dog if that works out." More people joined in with supportive comments. "I'll switch seats if it helps. We should all be thanking you, not making things harder." A businessman in an expensive suit closed his laptop and stood up from a nearby seat. "I'm a lawyer with Henderson and Associates. What's happening here is textbook discrimination. I'd be happy to provide my card." The atmosphere had completely transformed. What began as one man's struggle against an unfair system had become a spontaneous community event. People from all walks of life, different ages, backgrounds, and beliefs had found common ground in standing up for what they saw as right. A woman in a TSA uniform had been watching from the sidelines. She approached Thomas with professional courtesy. "Sir, when you do get your boarding pass, please see me at security. I'll make sure you and your service animal get through without any additional hassle." Thomas was overwhelmed. In his years with Rex, he'd grown accustomed to fighting small battles alone, explaining, justifying, educating. Never had he experienced this kind of widespread support from strangers. A young couple with matching backpacks pushed forward. The woman held out a water bottle. "For your dog," she said. "It's hot in here with all these people around." Thomas thanked her and poured some water into his cupped hand. Rex lapped it up gratefully, maintaining his professional demeanor even while drinking. The husband explained, "We train guide dogs as volunteers. What these airline folks don't understand is that service dogs like yours are actually safer and better behaved than most humans." Dr. Wilson was still recording, capturing the extraordinary scene unfolding. "This is exactly what we need more of," she said to no one in particular. People standing together. Suddenly, the crowd parted as a woman in an airline executive uniform made her way through. Her nameplate identified her as Ms. Rivera, Regional Director. Her expression was serious as she surveyed the scene, the halted check-in process, the crowd of supportive strangers, Thomas and Rex still waiting for their boarding passes, and her uncomfortable staff. "I need to understand what's happening here," she said, her voice carrying authority. She spotted the phones recording the scene and knew immediately this situation had escalated beyond a simple customer service issue. Thomas stood tall, Rex by his side. After everything that had happened in the last hour, he felt different. No longer was he a single veteran fighting to be heard. He now stood at the center of a circle of support that had formed spontaneously from the better nature of strangers. Ms. Rivera looked from Thomas to the crowd, then to her employees. The next few moments would determine how this story ended, not just for Thomas and Rex, but for everyone watching, recording, and participating in this unexpected moment of community action. Ms. Rivera's eyes swept across the scene, taking in every detail. 20 years in airline management had taught her to quickly assess situations, but she never encountered anything quite like this. The normal bustle of the check-in area had completely stopped. Passengers who should have been lining up were instead forming a protective circle around a man and his service dog. "I'm Gloria Rivera, Regional Director," she announced, her voice calm but authoritative. "Who can tell me what's happening here?" Several people started speaking at once. Ms. Rivera held up her hand. "One at a time, please." She pointed to Dr. Wilson, whose professional demeanor stood out. "Let's start with you." Dr. Wilson lowered her phone but didn't stop recording. "This gentleman is a veteran with a properly documented service dog. He's been denied boarding, publicly questioned about his disability, and made to wait for over 45 minutes now. I've been recording the interaction because it clearly violates federal regulations regarding service animals." Ms. Rivera turned to Thomas. "Sir, may I see your documentation?" Thomas handed over his folder for the third time that morning. Unlike the previous staff members, Ms. Rivera took her time reviewing each page. She examined Rex's certification, the letter from Thomas's doctor, and his military ID. The crowd watched in tense silence. Rex remained perfectly still, his training evident in how he handled the pressure of the situation. Finally, Ms. Rivera looked up. "Everything appears to be in perfect order." She turned to Bill and Painla, her expression stern. "Why wasn't this passenger checked in immediately?" Pamela started to speak. "The dog is too large for." "Service animals are exempt from size restrictions under the Air Carrier Access Act," Ms. Rivera interrupted. "This is covered extensively in our training. When was the last time either of you completed the disability compliance course?" Bill and Pamela exchanged uncomfortable glances. Ms. Rivera shook her head, then turned back to Thomas. "Sir, I want to personally apologize for how you've been treated today. This is not what our airline stands for, and it's certainly not how we train our staff to interact with veterans or passengers with service animals." The apology was clear and direct, no corporate doublespeak or attempts to minimize what had happened. Several people in the crowd nodded approvingly. "Thank you," Thomas said simply. Rex looked up at him, sensing the shift in his emotions. Ms. Rivera wasn't finished. She turned to address both her staff and the gathered crowd. "What happened here today is unacceptable. Our airline has always prided itself on being accessible to all passengers, including those with service animals." She paused, looking around at the phones still recording. "I want everyone to know that we will be launching an immediate review of our service animal policies and staff training procedures." She gestured to Bill and Pamela. "These two employees will be temporarily reassigned to complete comprehensive training on the Air Carrier Access Act and proper accommodation of passengers with disabilities. This isn't about punishment, it's about education." The elderly woman who had spoken about her Vietnam veteran husband smiled approvingly. "That's more like it," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Ms. Rivera turned back to Thomas. "Now let's get you checked in properly. Your flight to San Diego leaves in," she checked her watch, "40 minutes. We have time." She personally took Thomas to another counter, bypassing the line. Her fingers moved quickly over the keyboard as she processed his boarding pass. "I've upgraded you to first class," she said. "It's the least we can do. There's more legroom for Rex as well." As she handed Thomas his boarding pass, she added, "I'll also be personally escorting you to your gate to ensure there are no further issues." The crowd that had gathered began to applaud, not just for Thomas, but for the resolution. People smiled at each other, strangers connected by a shared moment of standing up for what was right. The young boys who had asked about Rex earlier waved excitedly. "The superhero and his sidekick won," the younger one called out. Thomas felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, relief, and something else he hadn't expected: pride. Not pride in himself, but in the spontaneous community that had formed around him. People who didn't know him, who had places to go and flights to catch, had taken the time to stand with a stranger because they believed it was the right thing to do. Ms. Rivera gestured toward the security checkpoint. "Shall we, sir?" Her respectful tone was a stark contrast to how the day had begun. Thomas walked beside Ms. Rivera through the terminal, Rex keeping perfect pace at his side. The regular hustle and bustle of the airport continued around them, but something had changed. People looked up from their phones and conversations as they passed. Some nodded respectfully. Others smiled. A few even clapped quietly. "Word travels fast in an airport," Ms. Rivera remarked. "Especially these days with social media." She wasn't wrong. Dr. Wilson's video was already being shared. By the time they reached the security checkpoint, the TSA agent was expecting them. "Sir," the agent said to Thomas with a nod of respect, "if you and your service animal will follow me, we have a separate screening area ready." The efficiency of the security process was a welcome change after the morning's difficulties. The TSA agents were professional and courteous, treating Rex with the respect due to a working animal. One agent, a former military man himself judging by his bearing, gave Thomas a supple salute as they passed through. As they approached the gate, Thomas was surprised to see a small gathering of people waiting. Some were faces he recognized from the check-in counter confrontation. Others must have heard about what happened and come to show support. The gate agent smiled warmly as Ms. Rivera and Thomas approached. "We're ready for pre-boarding whenever you are, sir," she said. "We've notified the flight crew about you and Rex." Ms. Rivera shook Thomas's hand. "Again, I apologize for your experience today. I hope the rest of your journey will be pleasant." She handed him her business card. "Please contact me directly if you have any issues on your return flight." As boarding was announced, something unexpected happened. The elderly woman from earlier, who had spoken about her Vietnam veteran husband, stood up from her seat in the waiting area. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice surprisingly strong. "Could I have everyone's attention for just a moment?" The gate area quieted as people looked toward her. "This young man," she said, pointing to Thomas, "served our country with honor. Today, he was treated with disrespect because of his service animal, who helps him with injuries most of us can't see." She paused, gathering herself. "My Harold came home from Vietnam with wounds nobody could see either. He never got the welcome home he deserved." Her voice cracked slightly, but she continued, "I think we should give this young man the respect he deserves right now." She began to clap, slowly and deliberately. One by one, others joined in. The businessman in the expensive suit, the off-duty flight attendant, the family with the 2 young boys, Dr. Wilson, the couple who had offered water for Rex. Soon, the entire gate area was filled with applause. Thomas stood still, overwhelmed by the spontaneous show of respect. Rex remained steady at his side, a constant reminder of why this whole situation had unfolded in the first place. As the applause died down, the boarding process began. Thomas and Rex were welcomed aboard first. The flight attendants greeted him warmly, one kneeling briefly to address Rex. "What a good boy you are," she said with genuine admiration. "Thank you both for your service." In first class, Thomas found himself seated next to the businessman who had offered legal help earlier. "That was something back there," the man said as they settled in. "In 20 years of flying, I've never seen anything like it." "Me neither," Thomas admitted. "I'm still processing it all." The businessman nodded thoughtfully. "You know, what happened today matters. It's not just about you and Rex. It's about the next veteran with a service animal who walks into that terminal." As the plane filled with other passengers, Thomas noticed many familiar faces from the check-in confrontation. The young family with the 2 boys was seated a few rows behind. The mother caught his eye and smiled warmly. The elderly woman who had started the applause was helped to her seat by an attentive flight attendant. Dr. Wilson nodded respectfully as she passed by. Once everyone was seated, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 237 to San Diego. Before we begin our safety briefing, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a special passenger with us today. We have a military veteran on board with his service animal. On behalf of the entire flight crew, we'd like to thank you for your service, sir." The cabin erupted in another round of applause. Thomas felt a lump in his throat as he nodded in acknowledgement. Rex remained calm at his feet, unaffected by the noise and attention. As the plane taxied away from the gate, Thomas pulled out his phone to text his sister. He had quite a story to tell her when he landed. "You won't believe what happened at the airport," he typed. Then he paused, considering how to explain everything. How a terrible moment of discrimination had transformed into something unexpected and powerful. How strangers had come together to stand up for what was right. How a community had formed out of nowhere, if only for an hour. In the end, he simply wrote, "I'll tell you everything when I land." But it reminded me of something Dad used to say. Sometimes people will surprise you in the best possible way. As the plane lifted into the clear blue sky, Thomas felt Rex shift slightly, settling in for the flight. The tension that had knotted his shoulders that morning had dissolved. In its place was something that felt a lot like hope. Dr. Wilson's video would eventually be viewed millions of times. The airline would follow through on Ms. Rivera's promise, implementing new training programs for all staff. Thomas would later be invited to consult on those programs, sharing his experience to help educate others. But those were stories for another day. For now, Thomas was simply grateful for Rex, for the unexpected allies he'd found, and for the reminder that even in difficult moments, people could come together in remarkable ways. The businessman nodded thoughtfully. "You know, what happened today matters. It's not just about you and Rex. It's about the next veteran with a service animal who walks into that terminal." As the plane filled with other passengers, Thomas noticed many familiar faces from the check-in confrontation. The young family with the 2 boys was seated a few rows behind. The mother caught his eye and smiled warmly. The elderly woman who had started the applause was helped to her seat by an attentive flight attendant. Dr. Wilson nodded respectfully as she passed by. Once everyone was seated, The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Flight 237 to San Diego. Before we begin our safety briefing, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a special passenger with us today. We have a military veteran on board with his service animal. On behalf of the entire flight crew, we'd like to thank you for your service, sir." The cabin erupted in another round of applause. Thomas felt a lump in his throat as he nodded in acknowledgement. Rex remained calm at his feet, unaffected by the noise and attention. As the plane taxied away from the gate, Thomas pulled out his phone to text his sister. He had quite a story to tell her when he landed. "You won't believe what happened at the airport," he typed. Then he paused, considering how to explain everything. How a terrible moment of discrimination had transformed into something unexpected and powerful. How strangers had come together to stand up for what was right. How a community had formed out of nowhere, if only for an hour. In the end, he simply wrote, "I'll tell you everything when I land." But it reminded me of something Dad used to say: sometimes people will surprise you in the best possible way. As the plane lifted into the clear blue sky, Thomas felt Rex shift slightly, settling in for the flight. The tension that had knotted his shoulders that morning had dissolved. In its place was something that felt a lot like hope. Dr. Wilson's video would eventually be viewed millions of times. The airline would follow through on Ms. Rivera's promise, implementing new training programs for all staff. Thomas would later be invited to consult on those programs, sharing his experience to help educate others. But those were stories for another day. For now, Thomas was simply grateful for Rex, for the unexpected allies he found, and for the reminder that even in difficult moments, people could come together in remarkable ways.